All right, what's up, gamers? It's Actions and Reactions. Welcome to our Grand Strategy podcast. This is our first episode, so we're really going to be introducing what this podcast is about, who we are, what our backgrounds are, and then really just getting into the idea of grand strategy games as an overview. Not so much what they are, but what are some things we enjoy about them, what makes a good grand strategy game in a single player and a multiplayer context. And then also just evaluating the grand strategy games we have experience in, and just kind of looking at how they're different, how they're similar, and how they work in different contexts. So, John, why don't you get into some of the things that we just want to cover, and what this podcast is going to be about in the
So,
long run?
so we're definitely hoping to get a lot of hot takes onto the playing field. I think Josh and I have a lot of disagreements and a lot of agreements. We approach things and appreciate things from extremely different perspectives, and I think that the sort of our unique paths and the types of things that we're interested in will lead to a lot of different criticisms and sort of praises in this space. Like this space has three sort of big franchises, in my opinion. That is the Civilization franchise, Paradox titles, and Total War titles. All three of these games or franchises are extremely different in the way that they present themselves, the types of challenges you have against the AI, against other players, sort of the level of abstraction that you sort of work in the grand strategy. Um, then we're also going to start sort of. Josh and I play in a PvP grand strategy game group, so we're probably going to get into some stories and things like that that we think are compelling. And we really want to get into like the nitty gritty layers to a game: tactics, strategy, doctrine, which I don't think a lot of people talk about, economic depth, character depth, and things like this. And hopefully, this will be done in sort of a potentially controversial, hot takey way where, we'll make you guys think about your perspective on grand strategy games.
Yeah, that's good. We're also hoping to, as new games come out by different publishers, or maybe a new Total War title or Civilization 7, which seems to be around the corner, as these come out, as we see developer diaries of these things, just try and give our takes, pre-release and then at release, of what we think, what our hopes are for those. And then really one thing that I think we fit an interesting niche is a lot of players play these grand strategy games either single player or in these very curated multiplayer settings. A good example is the Civilization games, where if you play those online in multiplayer, it changes how turns work and makes the game shorter. Whereas we play essentially a single player campaign, but in multiplayer, where you're building your nation over the 300 turns or 300 years or whatever it happens to be, and we play it against each other. So we've got a little bit of a different niche there.
And,
So that's
and
a lot. Oh, yeah,
sorry,
go
sorry to
ahead.
interrupt. I just wanted to add on. I think it adds a very unique perspective and a unique stressor. One thing that's going to come up time and time again is that we have basically concluded as a group that a lot of online advice, tutorials, things like this, it sort of exist in a space where fighting the AI just does not sort of stress the game and stress the mechanics enough to fully explore the game. And we're hoping to sort of like convey that in some respects. Like I think this is a very unique perspective to look at grand strategy games.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're by no means the undisputed masters of these games. We just have our own perspective that I think would be valuable to share here.
Absolutely.
So, that being said, we've kind of got an idea of what this podcast is going to be. It's not going to be that in one episode. But just to give a bit of background about us, John, why don't you just go into like how you got into grand strategy in the first place? Where did you come from? What do you like about it?
So my gateway into grand strategy, it's not technically a grand strategy game, is Age of Empires 2. It's the medieval era version of the game. I think a lot of people view that game with a lot of nostalgia. Um, I think that that game presented itself to me like sort of a situation where it's RTS, so it's real time strategy, not grand strategy, and I really appreciated sort of the battles and tactics of playing against other players online. I don't know if people remember this, but I can't remember who it was. Maybe it was Microsoft or someone hosted online servers all the way back in that day. I must have been like 10 or 11. Like this was 20 years ago or something like that. And you can actually go online and do PvP, right? And I got into some competitive spaces. Sort of a strange thing that will keep coming up is that I actually got introduced to a space that really like restricted the mechanics of the game, and sort of like stringently made the meta very obvious. But anyways, moving on from that, I think about in 2005, I moved on to Total War, and this was like my main game forever. Rome Total War 1, I played that so much. I was obsessed with that game. Around that time, I also started getting friends into it, and we would do, LAN parties to do battles and things like this. There was no multiplayer campaign at that point. Then moving on to Medieval Total War 2, that was also incredibly fun. Empire was great. Shogun 2 was the first time that they introduced PvP online, like actual support for that. So I got very involved in doing battles online, but I never really tried doing campaigns because it's hard to find partners and groups of people to do something like that with. But basically, what ended up happening was I was like a Total War fanatic at this point. Like this was like the only strategy game that I played. And then Rome 2 came out. I think it was about 2012, and it was a huge bust. The game, to be frank, sucked. Like the battles went from being I don't know. I don't know what I considered to be realistic. Units had weight and cavalry charges and basically what ended up happening is the battles ended up feeling extremely short and they felt very arcadey. And anyways, so I tried that game out and I basically hated it, and that made me run away from the Total War series, and I jumped into specifically Paradox's Stellaris, which was my main experience with Paradox up until that point, and then Civilization 5. Stellaris was something I experienced more as like a co-op with friends, a very casual experience. Civilization was something that I eventually got into originally co-op with friends, and then I started doing I forget what the mod is called, but there's a competitive PvP mod that you can download to make Civilization 5 more
Yeah, it
competitive.
like rebalances it and makes
Yeah,
it more competitive in a multiplayer setting.
yeah, so I got into stuff like that and so on and so forth, and then around just before COVID, I got back into Shogun 2 as a co-op thing with a friend, and eventually we sort of got bored of beating it on very hard, or legendary, whichever one is the hardest, and we moved into experimenting because this is also a difficult thing to do with your friends is experimenting with PvP campaigns because it's like a very personal thing, building up this empire and watching it crumble. Your good friend is
Absolutely.
stomping all over your empire, right? Um, so we did that primarily in Rome 2. We did that for a very long time before jumping over to Imperator because Rome 2 is really limiting in the fact that you can't actually play with more than two people in a PvP campaign, so it's just one on one. We moved over to Imperator and we had a good group of guys there for a while, about four people continuously, with people being swapped out. But we sort of beat that game to death and optimized it to death. So we've now switched over into Warhammer 3, which is sort of adding a fantasy. It's my first non-historical sort of title. So,
I guess other than Stellaris, but yeah.
oh yeah, I guess yeah, that's that's definitely fair. That's definitely fair. So I think Josh and I have had very sort of different um, paths. I know you're primarily a Paradox player, right, Josh?
Yeah, so I actually started kind of the reverse of you. Like you went Age of Empires 2, so RTS, which that was actually my starting point. Like Age of Empires, the Command and Conquer games. Played Halo Wars on the Xbox way back in the day as well.
Oh yeah,
But my
yeah.
real first grand strategy game would have been, I think, Civilization 2. So we had this like really old computer, and I forget how we got Civ 2, and played that. I was like 5 years old, didn't really understand the point of it. I remember running, I think they were called phalanxes, well into like the 20th century, playing on very easy, so it was fine.
You
So
think they were called phalanxes, spoken like a true non-Total War player.
yeah. So I was really just there to see my cities get big, and my goal was always to build every single wonder in the game. I don't know if I ever got that, but I started at Civ 2, went into Civ 3, um, playing some like RTS games, some of the tycoon games on the side as well, like Roller Coaster Tycoon, Zoo Tycoon, Circus Tycoon. They're kind of fun. So definitely that strategy feel. But the first time I really got into the whole concept and understood, like, okay, there's a long-term strategy game, would have been Civ 5.
Okay.
So this is probably around like 2009, 2010. I got into that game and put hundreds, if not thousands, of hours into that game, and just loved it. I was super excited for Civilization 6, and then when that came out, anyone who followed that launch, just you'll know that there was some lack of depth to the game. There were things that were kind of clunky. They changed the art style, which was jarring for some people. So I had picked up Europa Universalis 4, which at the time was the most popular Paradox game, and kind of played it here and there, but I was mostly into Civilization 6 at this time, or the Civilization series at this time. And this is around 2016, I think. When Civ 6 sucked, in my opinion, I switched over to Paradox games and quickly fell in love with those. Played a ton of EU4, got into the Crusader Kings series, especially when Crusader Kings 3 came out, played some Stellaris, and then kind of intersected in this path with John with Imperator Rome. So I just loved that game with the population mechanics, with really the ability to craft your specific nation however you want. There's right and wrong ways, but I loved that whole nation building aspect. And then recently, I also did switch over to Warhammer 3, and I'm just loving the asymmetry, the fantasy elements, and all of that. So I guess we've converged towards a similar trajectory in all of this. I also have a big board game background. Any of you board gamers out there might know of like Caverna, Scythe, Dune. They aren't grand strategy games. You can play these in like a couple of hours, but there's a lot of elements that are very similar there.
I find it really interesting that our path was different, but it was almost the same in the sense that you followed the Civilization series, I followed the Total War series, and when those like anyone who basically what happened was both of those games like released a new title, disappointed us, and then we were pushed into Paradox
Pushed into
almost.
Paradox. Yeah, exactly. Um, I feel like there's maybe something there that we could unpack further. But maybe that's just the niche that Paradox lives in, where it shows you what could be more. It kind of has a lower threshold or a higher floor of quality, but then the glory that Total War and Civilization can give you is maybe higher. I don't know if that's something that we want to fully get into, but there's
Yeah,
maybe something there that's interesting.
yeah.
Um, so this is interesting then. We both have these different trajectories and how we got to where we are now, primarily playing Warhammer 3. I've gone back a little bit to Civilization, but I think it's probably interesting to talk about what we even like in grand strategy games. We're pretty much having a very loose definition of what a grand strategy game is, and we don't want to get too in the weeds of that. But John, what do you like? Why did you even get into Rome Total War 1 in the first place? What got you hooked on that?
So there's an obvious statement, and then there's like sort of the non-obvious. Why is this why this grand strategy over a different grand strategy, right? So the obvious statement is, from a young age, I was very into history. This podcast isn't about history, but I was very into Roman history, as it turned out when Rome came out. So it was like a huge hit for me. Um, but the but I think the thing that's sort of core, that it is, starting out there, when I was younger, was that these are like sincerely challenging games, especially for like as you're learning them, getting up to the point where you can beat these games at the hardest level. Is like very interesting and very challenging, and then Total War does it in a way where you feel like you're like a general in history. So I mean, like, that's of course really
It's the
interesting.
perfect combination for you.
But going on to sort of a thing of, why this game versus another game, it's really I have a deep appreciation for what I would like to dub emergent depth and complexity. And what I mean by that, and this is going to be a recurring theme, I'm going to beat this horse until it's dead, is if you're a board game person, one of the things that you can sort of um, think about is a game like chess. And then, I'm sorry, Josh, I'm going to throw Scythe under the bus here, um,
Fair enough.
and compare it to a game like Scythe. Now, chess is an extremely simple game. You can teach that to a child in a sitting about how all of the pieces work. You know, maybe it's going to be difficult for them to remember, blah blah blah. But if you then, but then you see the complexity and the beauty with these rules working together, right? Like no one can argue that you could play a game like Scythe at the level of like a grandmaster in chess. You know what I mean? And Scythe, when you present when it's presented, is it has a lot of rules. It's very complex, but at least in my limited experience of it, it seems like a game that's optimal. Like you need a certain amount of depth to make a board game like not solvable in some sense, like like who would win with perfect play. Scythe seems like a game that has an answer to that question, and basically that's something that I really appreciate about grand strategy games is that a lot of the games will take very simple but interacting mechanics and create this incredible sort of depth that's also amplified when you add other human beings in as your opponents. So we can touch on that and go in more in depth at a later date, but that's what I'm going to call emergent depth is something that I really enjoy. Another thing that I really enjoy is sort of a sense of meta discovery. The games are complex enough that when you start them, it's not clear what's good and what's not good. And so it's really fun figuring out these sort of complex sort of like beasts that you need to master. And so there's sort of bonus points too for me if a game can arrive at a point where there's no true meta. And what I mean by no true meta is there's no actual optimal way to play. There's several optimal ways to play that might counter each other, and so there's sort of like a feedback loop. Um, and of course, a very good grand strategy game creates a scenario where you are engaged and you have challenges from start to finish. So getting to a space where there's no snowballing. So Solaris does this really well, where the early game is very hard, and then there's crises. So if you're playing on a hard enough difficulty, you should be in a situation where there's always something that you actually, you might you might barely escape the crisis or something like that, right? And these
Right,
ga-
absolutely.
and these games are like very different than any other single player type game. Like I understand that there's a community out there that replays Skyrim over and over again, but this game, like grand strategy games, especially those that offer like asymmetry in the types of playthroughs, like Total War and like other grand strategy games, get this by having different sort of civilization mechanics or faction mechanics. So it really gives you like a replayability like that other games just can't offer. Like in Skyrim, you're always the Dragonborn, but in Total War, you can play as Rome, then you can play as Carthage, then you can play as an Iberian tribe, then you can play as a Britannic tribe, then you can play as Parthia. You know what I mean? Like these are all like extremely different looks and extremely different factions, and it's sort of you know, sort of a very sort of beautiful concept in a very challenging space to learn and grow in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing I want to just go back to before we just kind of talk about some of the things that I like in this is you mentioned the idea of the meta, or the correct way to play. And I think for a lot of people that have a lot of experience with grand strategy games, immediately a couple things will come to mind. Civilization 5 is notorious for having a very, very rigid meta unless you are playing with a mod that changes that. Uh,
Yes.
is it? Would you be able to very quickly just give an example of a game that has a rigid meta or what that looks like, and then another game where it's a lot more open ended, just for some of our newer listeners to kind of get a good idea about that?
So definitely, like as you said, a civilization game. You can expand on this if you want, but a civilization game basically, there's not as much. what do I want to say, counterplay to different factions. There's lots of different choices. You can basically be, every it's not every civilization, but there's a huge list of civilizations, right? And these civilizations at the end of the day basically boil down to a couple of unique features to the civilization. They give them bonuses, and then a couple bonuses and then a unique unit, right? Like a unique military unit, and that unique
Right.
military unit is on one end going to have a time in the sun, when it's technologically relevant. But the basic point is that not all of these units and not all of these bonuses, like these two bonuses, I believe it is. Not all of these bonuses are created equally. And basically, what that does is it basically creates a rigid meta where some factions are just deeply and truly better than other factions. And even down more to the game mechanics, when you get into more of a PvP situation, there's really only one way to play. Like, for example, how should you use trade routes? Well, trade routes to a new player, it sounds really nice to make money. So there's two ways to use trade routes. One is to make money by trading with other factions, or one is to send food to another city internal to your um, into your faction. And it turns out that one of these things is just better. You should just grow your population by sending food. And I know that might sound like a very like sort of trivial thing, but basically the game presents you with a lot of variety, but it's sort of false variety in the sense that if you actually want to play optimally, there's only one way to play. Now,
Yeah. Yeah, I
uh,
think that's very difficult for a developer to make a game where there are three or four or maybe even more truly unique paths to an optimal play style.
absolutely.
But I definitely think, though, when you get to a game where you do see something approaching that, or where maybe different factions, their optimal play looks different, even though there might be a rigid meta for that specific faction or civilization or whatever you call it, I think that adds a lot of variety that just shakes things up and makes it more interesting. You can be someone who spends hundreds or thousands of hours learning the meta for one faction or group, and then you have to completely relearn everything for a different one, even if
Absolutely.
it's still a rigid meta, but you have uh, different end games for each of those.
Absolutely. In a game, in my opinion, people might fight me on this, but a game or games that have sort of no true meta. There's things that are meta and there's things that aren't, but basically it is basically Total War titles. And the way that this is achieved is that each faction will get typically its own sort of economic buildings that you build into your economy, to build up how much money you're making, how productive you are, how many troops you can raise, and all of these things. But they'll also get completely different military units, unless they're from sort of like the same type of civilization. Like Greek factions will have very similar unit rosters. And basically, what that ends up giving you is asymmetry in the armies. But what you're going to end up getting is, and I understand that there's going to be, PvP battle community people that might be tempted to watch this, and they're going to think, well, like what he's saying isn't meta or whatever. So I'm thinking about this purely from a grand strategy, like PvP campaign perspective. There's going to be factions that sort of fall into the same tier as each other, and there's going to be a lot of them that fall into the same tier of each other. And some of these factions are going to counter the strengths of other factions. But a lot of times you're going to get things that are like pure counterplay. So, for example, um, how do you counter horse archers if the other faction has a lot of horse archers? Well, you mass archers or you mass slingers in Realm Total War 2, right? But then if they stop using horse archers, then your archers might not be as useful because they've sort of lost one of the core features that you deployed them for, right?
You
Um,
really get this rock paper scissors effect, as opposed to just I did the best thing better than you did the best thing.
Precisely, and you sort of get to the situation where you might outfit your army for the wrong battle, right? And so there's no one army that you can bring to the field that solves all problems.
So I think this is a good segue. We've talked a little bit about the meta here, and this is maybe something that we can talk about. Well, we're going to talk about it a little bit more today, but also in future episodes. But what we're really getting down to here is decision making, right? Having like real decisions where there's maybe not a wrong answer,
Yes,
and then seeing the impact of those decisions, and you're not always making the same decision every time. And so, what I'm understanding from you is that your main draw in for these strategy games is seeing these decisions, and largely you've talked about how this plays out in the battle, in the military conflict with each other.
that's
Uh,
true.
if
Yes.
I'm not misrepresenting you there. So my take on this is a little bit different, and you can probably kind of guess where I'm coming from with
Yeah.
my background more in civilization. Is I love seeing these decisions in the nation building aspect of the game. So civilization is pretty much all nation building. Typically, my best games are when I don't even fight any wars, or just fight wars when I'm like 3 tech eras ahead of somebody and just steamroll them.
Hmm.
But I love that crafting of something as simple as like, what order am I going to build my buildings, or like, can I get in Civ 5, I always wanted 4 cities, National College up, and everything good to go by turn 100. And there was always like very specific things. How much can I stress the internal workings of my country to get it as optimal as possible so that the actual conflict parts are as easy as possible? I want the war to be won before it's even declared. And so that's something that I always loved and would look for. And then asymmetry too, both in terms of your militaries, but in also what your nation even looks like. And I think a really good example for this, the Total War games have a good example for this in horde factions that don't even own settlements in any
Yes.
capacity.
Yep.
But then you also have this in Imperator Rome, where you have the idea of tribes and settled nations, so republics or kingdoms in whatever capacity. And tribes have entirely different pop types. They raise armies in a completely different fashion, and they have completely different ways of making money and researching. They don't really research. So frankly, they're worse, but the potential there is very interesting, where you have a completely different structured society represented in the game, that can be on the same level or even better than what we might look back through our own lens of like, what does the world look like, and say, oh, that's worse or that's different, but you can still get these like competing options. I think that's just like a really interesting thing to have. And then you alluded to this very, very briefly, but just talking about having like a constant challenge, and this is something that's often a drawback of strategy games. Is if you have a really good first 2 3 hours of a campaign, the rest of it is just clicking next turn or just waiting for you to win.
Yeah. Yep.
And so I think that's something that's super important. Often we see difficulty settings just change when you hit that critical mass and just steamroll the game. But something I think that's also interesting is having a rise and fall of intensity. And I guess what I mean by that is I think the Paradox games do a really good job of this, where you can start as a very, very small local power in a region where you maybe own one little city or province or territory, whatever the game calls it, and everyone's kind of your equal, and you have to find out how you're going to navigate these alliance chains, and then you eventually win a couple of what are supposed to be nail biter, but you can figure out how to cheese the AI and win these wars, and then you become kind of the big fish in a small pond, and so then you kind of clean everything up, and now your competitors aren't these other small powers, but it's these other regional powers. So maybe you started as a German city state, you eat up a bunch of other German city states. How do I deal now with the larger ones like Bavaria or Prussia or
Sure.
Austria or something? And then you build out from there. Now you're Germany. How do you deal with the Ottoman Empire or France? So having these kind of this roller coaster ride of like, it's very difficult, then you kind of get to sit back and reap those rewards, and then it's difficult again. I think just having it always be difficult is just mentally draining. That might just be for me. But I think having this rise and fall of intensity, ideally with a crescendo at the end, is really something I think is good to have, and it's easiest to see in a multiplayer context where typically there's a big war or something at the end that everything is building
Yeah,
for.
yeah. So I just want to jump in there and say like, okay, so like what I meant there when I briefly alluded to that was basically like the same. Like you want to get out of your local region, but you don't want to arrive to a grander stage without rivals, if that makes sense.
Exactly. If the game is literally just clean up your small little area and then you've won, and then it's just a matter of marching, then like, why would you play beyond turn 50 or
Yes.
beyond 2 hours or something like that. There needs to be always another boogeyman around the corner. It's probably
This
a good way to put it.
this is something that some Total War games really struggle with, where even if you do arrive on a grander stage, the AI will be sort of like poorly programmed, and they'll still be recruiting early game units. So in the future, when I do advocate for Rome 2, I am advocating for Rome 2 Total War in a sense of like you need mods to make that game actually playable in the way that in the way that Josh and I are advocating right now.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's probably something that would make a really good podcast in the future, just talking about mods in the
Yes,
context of grand strategy games. How do they work? How don't they work? Like what's our kind of thought process there?
agreed.
Um, but we've kind of arrived now, somewhat tangentially, at talking about how these games work somewhat differently in a multiplayer context. So I think we have this is where we start to get, I believe, into some diverging opinions, although we have kind of the same overarching understanding here.
Yeah.
John, where are you at with these games?
So I love multiplayer because I think that okay, so single player sort of presents sort of an interesting context where you're like in survival mode, and it's only interesting as long as you're surviving, right? But inevitably in all strategy games, no matter how well they're written, you're going to get into snowball mode. I have no more rivals, right? Now, and the thing is that what I want to claim is that the way to get there is actually suboptimal, or it very rarely stresses you to the point of fully appreciating, understanding, fully appreciating and understanding the game mechanics. Like, there's not enough stress in the single player setting to really push you over the top. Especially this is experience mostly coming from things like Stellaris, Civilization. It just felt like the AI was harder, but eventually you get past them. And Total War, you know, it's very easy, at least in my experience, for a more experienced person to get to the point where you're just playing on. You can play every faction on the hardest setting, and sort of make that work in the single player setting. Right? There's only so far you can go in the single player setting, and multiplayer really gets you to the point where it's like, okay, now I'm playing against someone that can also do that against the AI. All of a sudden, I need to really look into the depths of this game, and this is something that we really did in Imperator. So this is the first game that Josh and I played against each other. And Imperator is very transparent about how different types of calculations and battles and how those work. It's really easy to tell what you know how good your military is, how good you expect their military to be. It's also very easy to look up how to optimize economies. Well, when I say easy to look up, it's they have a wiki and all the formulas are there. So you can do your
It's
homework.
actually maintained. I hate that about the Warhammer games. Like I think they stopped maintaining at the beginning of Warhammer 1, and that just bugged me because spreadsheets are just
Yeah,
my bread and butter.
Josh is a spreadsheet king. When we play, I play more on optimizing for the fact that we're playing PvP. Josh really plays on like I'm going to be the best single player person in this game. You will be an AI to me by the end of this. That is Josh's like that or like a joke about how Josh sort of approaches it. And basically what my claim is that this can actually really drive you to the point where it becomes clear if a lot of things in the game are complexity for complexity's sake, or if there's real depth to the game. Um, so we optimized in Pure to death. It wasn't overnight, but basically every time you get through a campaign and you're going to start a new one, or even during a campaign, you basically realize you did something wrong, or you realize you wanted to do something different, or you stumbled across something that you think is going to be broken. And we went through. I'm just going to throw out a random number. I don't know the actual number, but probably like 5 to 6 significant meta shifts. And by the
Mhm.
last one, I was just sort of done because I was basically like, okay, so we've arrived at a point where if you don't do these like 7 things or 6 things, then you're not competitive. And those 6 to 7 things are sort of at the point where it's ruining the immersion of the game, right?
you're essentially breaking the game and reducing it to just a series of numbers and letters, and it takes you out of the idea of I am running a country set in like 300 BC.
Yes, and so my point is that sort of the fast-paced nature and competitive nature of PvP basically means that learning the game is sort of amplified. The whole community works towards optimizations, counters, ideas. It's especially good if you have an open community that communicates with each other a lot. I think unfortunately for people in our group, Josh and I communicate quite a bit about our about our ideas, so we have a little bit of a competitive edge. Um, and I think like a lot of like really beautiful aspects of the games or the things that we want really get amplified. Like again, like the AI being of a decent quality adds so much flavor and depth to PvP. Um, I understand that it you want AI to be good in single player, of course, but at least having AI that's like somewhat passable makes PvP so much more enjoyable. Like I feel like in Civilization, you basically can't play PvP with AI. Um, but in a game like
Right.
Imperator, it was a little tougher because the AI could be very easily cheesed. Like the AI would have to be like overwhelmingly strong to matter in PvP wars. I found, but in Total War, we like I have some epic memories of AI just coming in absolutely clutch. Like there was one time I was playing a Rome 2 game and I was attacking my opponent in like Egypt or something, right? And basically in like Dacia or like basically like the modern day Romania area, um my AI ally basically like pinned, I want to say like I don't know, like a pretty significant portion of of my enemies armies like in the north. And it was just like it was such a nice feeling watching an AI army beat beat my opponent in the field. Like it's just so satisfying. And that's just a thing that you don't get I don't know. Maybe that's like it's not really multiplayer changes that, but I guess like I don't know. Anyways,
Having AI that feels like it's another player, maybe just like a one that's behind on the meta, it just helps flesh out the game, I think, if that's what you're
absolutely,
getting at.
almost universally. Like I don't think it matters for multiplayer, so maybe this is a bad place to put the point or to say the point. But anyway, so a part of me then feels like asymmetry becomes less important because the replayability of the game comes down to optimizing and fighting the player, and asymmetry complicates the way PvP feels because then it's hard to balance. It's hard to figure out um, like for example, we played a big game where we had a person in Italy in Imperator as Umbria, and then we had Josh as Scythia. And at the beginning of the game, we thought this was, we were kind of worried about how good Josh would be. He's a tribe, whatever. And it was a very asymmetrical situation, and it turned out that that Josh like figured out how to optimize his faction to the point where he was deploying like a million troops, and I had to ally the person in Italy, and we were able to fight Josh like 2v1 basically, and we were deploying like maybe 400,000 troops, like maybe, and we were broke, like we were spending to our maximum, and Josh, because of the way his mechanics worked, like he was just like rolling in cash while deploying like a million troops. And so asymmetry just presents this thing where it's like it's still beautiful and it's still very fun to have asymmetric fights against other players, but it sort of adds an extra burden to organization around you don't want to beat another player simply because your faction is better. Like you don't want a civ situation where you're just playing one faction is simply better than the other, and like with perfect play, A should always beat B or something like that, right? So asymmetry causes a little bit of friction, but I think it's still nice to have in some contexts.
I think a good example of that is the Warhammer climate system, where as I understand it, Warhammer is geared, the Total War games in general are geared towards the battles.
Hmm.
And for those of you who don't know, the Warhammer climate system means all the different factions have different areas that they like to live in better or worse. So some like to live in mountains, some like to live in jungles. Some like to live in desert, some like to live in the Arctic. And so what it means is that these factions should all be balanced to a certain degree in terms of how do they actually fight against each other, how well do they expand, how rich do they get. But they want different areas of the world to own. And this doesn't have to be the only type of asymmetry, but it means that if John and I are fighting against each other with our nations, something might be more valuable to me than it is for him, or vice versa. And that can create very interesting situations where maybe he's doing something just to deny me of having it. Or he did deny me of something, and that really hurts, but it doesn't really give him much of an advantage. And this actually can help to keep a game more competitive in the long run, because then it's not just one person kind of hits critical mass earlier and runs away with it. Um,
Yes. Yep.
that's just one example of it. Um, I did want to kind of go back. You mentioned at the kind of beginning of this that we talked about stressing the game. And I think you're absolutely correct there. Although I think there are a couple of caveats that can be made to this. And one is that you're stressing different aspects of the game. Um, the best example I can give of this is in Europa Universalis. A common thing for people to do is do a world conquest.
Yep.
And the ideas, well, they literally call them ideas in the game. The ideas that are good for doing a world conquest are dramatically different from what you want to do against a different opponent. And so you're stressing things like how quickly can I expand and not have my nation implode on me? How much land can I take at once? How many AIs can I fight at the same time and still be able to win? Whereas in a multiplayer version of the exact same game, you're trying to be a lot more methodical and you care more about building up a very tall, dense, coherent nation that can essentially fight forever, but just not on a million fronts and can't expand as fast. So you're stressing potentially different things. Although I do think there is a lot more depth when you're stressing it in multiplayer because you do have more intelligent opponents there. Um,
Yeah, I can appreciate that. I can definitely appreciate that. I guess the problem for me is that basically like you could imagine a scenario where there was no limit to how good the AI could be, and then you could, speaking from a person who always tries to play on the hardest setting, um, you could imagine a scenario where like okay, so let's claim that some meta exists or some pseudo meta that's really like a revolving door on metas that are all meta like whatever, right? And so you could imagine a situation where like I understand that you're sort of like optimally trying to optimally beat the AI, but I guess I'm coming from a perspective where I'm imagining that you want to play the best opponents, right? And like whatever the game looks like as the AI scales up to some type of human intelligence, like I guess I'm almost like guaranteeing that my interpretation of like what depth in the game looks like is the right one. But like the other one kind of feels like I'm optimally cheesing the game. Does that make sense?
right. Yeah, no, it does. Just going back to that example in Europa Universalis, it essentially becomes a game, like an arcade game where you're shooting to get the high score, where the high score is just how quickly can you conquer the entire world.
It's like
So
speed
people
running
will
basically.
exactly. It turns into a speed run or doing things incredibly difficult. Like, can you convert the entire world to the same religion and same culture? Like things like that.
Right.
So it's kind of seeing like what can you get away with? How either how quickly can you beat the game or how hard can you beat the game?
Yeah.
Actually beating the game isn't the challenge. Whereas in a multiplayer context, it's dubious to say in a lot of grand strategy games that anyone ever really beats the game. Like it never gets to the point where someone just like full annexes everybody else.
Yes.
Um, so you have
Especially
different
if you're
goals.
especially if you're playing with paradox mechanics, like you're never ever gonna annex everybody.
Yeah, exactly. And even if you could, people are probably just going to bow out and concede defeat before it gets there.
Yes.
Um,
Yes. I mean,
so
usually our games end like a clear trigger for our game ending is one of two things. One is we reach an era of parity where we don't see it ever changing, or two is we reach a thing like a place where it just feels like someone is clearly
like it's inevitable.
it's inevitable that person's gonna win, um, or three, we also try to throw like role playing into it. And if it sort of gets to the point where the only way to reasonably continue the game in any sort of balance is to break role play, we'll also back off
Yeah,
from
and
that.
we're not dressing up as like Spartans and Speedos, although as much as that would be incredible, but we just try and like honestly represent our nation. So if we're Greeks, let's actually pretend to be a Greek and that type of thing.
Yeah, yeah, and just sort of try to be, look out for our best interests, kind of thing.
Exactly.
Like be honest. It's a way to escape so that we're able to basically like, gaslight, emotionally abuse each other, like that kind of thing.
All those good things, exactly.
All those good things you
Now,
want in a diplomacy game.
exactly. So you mentioned diplomacy. I think this is the one thing that I want to get to next, just in this little segment here. Um, it's important that in a multiplayer context, you're playing against people and not the AI. So for me, I found that a lot of the deals that I like to make playing against a person are a lot more intricate and kind of outside the mechanics of what a game offers. So
Yes.
saying like, okay, like there's no real diplomacy button I can click to do this in the game, but we're still going to make a deal around this. And then there's the whole thing of like, well, do you trust the person? Maybe they've lied in the past to you, or
Yes.
maybe they could have ulterior motives, or maybe they say yes, but then they also have an opposing deal with somebody else. And then we have to figure out how do those two things mix together. And I find this is always a very interesting thing to navigate. I think, John, you and I have very different approaches. We both enjoy this part, but we have very different default approaches to how we go about diplomacy. But I find this is just something that spices up the game significantly, where I could be playing a very poorly made grand strategy game. I could be playing four-way chess with people, and
Hmm.
it would still feel like a very deep game where you're making decisions not just on what happens on the board or what happens in the game, but also, okay, what are the other people going to do? What deals do they have, and what deals do I need to uphold or betray? And
Yeah.
it's just it adds so much.
Yeah, it adds like a layer of sandboxness, if that's a word, to the game, just because you're interacting like with humans. Like I like the fact that Josh isn't a lawyer in real life is beyond me. Some of the documents that he sends me are so intricate with like clauses and like, conditional statements and like, break, like, conditions to break and conditions to continue the contract or like renew the like all these things, right? Like they're very intricate, very interesting. Like I've had business documents sent to me that were like not even remotely as complicated as the things that I have to read for multiplayer in these games with the with our group. A thing that Josh doesn't end up trying to do, but I find it's like sort of my MO in these games, is I'm really interested in trying to set up world governments or like rule based world orders where they're sort of like tipped slightly into my favor. So for example, when I was like Fazan, I was a very like trade based empire in Puritor, and I basically set up what do we call it? It's like the World Economic Forum,
Yeah, WEF. Yeah.
WEF, and I basically set it up to be completely about free trade and me being able to exercise the fact that I had the largest share of trade in the world. And so this is like what and so like basically whatever my power feature is, or the thing that separates me from other empires, I try to establish that as my
Like the defining characteristic of the world order.
yeah, and another thing that I like to do is I like to create this is super toxic, but like I like to create dependent relationships where a player ends up being like super dependent on me. And like this is like something you can't really do with the AI, because I mean the AI always ends up being dependent on you if you really want to make it that way. But basically, you want to construct sort of an us versus them, I'll protect you situation with somebody, and then over time, eventually they'll start realizing that like, oh, this isn't actually a good deal for me. Like I'm the front lines. Like he's not really doing anything, but like basically using diplomacy as a tool to
Mhm.
exert power and influence. Like Josh secures treaties and partnerships um, and things like that. But I try to secure power and influence through diplomacy as much as possible. It's a miracle that these guys still trust me. But
Yeah, I don't get it. My saying, and I think it's kind of a joke in the group, is the worst thing to be is your ally because that's the person who always dies.
Yeah, if someone's gonna die or be like significantly downsized, it's gonna be my ally, and but that's not. But like you have to throw in some moments where you're also like helping people. You know, like I'll help people expand. It's like it's a good deal until it's not a good deal. You know what I mean?
Right. You have to make them. You have to trick them into accepting it. It'll be different this time. It's kind of like a toxic relationship.
It is a toxic relationship. Yeah.
Yeah.
Someone. Yeah. 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 I mean, we shouldn't talk about our current playthrough, but like things. This trend is going to continue.
Great. I'm looking forward to it. So we've kind of gone over a lot of general principles here. We both mentioned that we've got three big grand strategy series that we're kind of into, have some experience with. So that being Paradox titles, Civilization, and the Total War games. So I think it would be kind of useful to just kind of briefly go over each of these and just say like how well do the things we like or look for in a game map onto each of these, both in a single player but more so in a multiplayer context. So I think we both had the Paradox titles first, just in how we went through this. So John, why don't you get into that?
So my main experiences with Stellaris and Imperator. So with Paradox and in Stellaris in particular, the thing that as a PvP title, like I just don't like it. Even as a single player, like I love the concept. The thing that I hated was when I actually played this game, it felt like the game was like completely changed every couple of months, where it would completely break your understanding of how to optimally build an economy, how to optimally build a military, and so on and so forth. And I also felt like a really core thing that I really like about these games is war fighting. And at the end of the day, wars felt extremely cheesy, especially with the technology mechanics sort of centered around like you could really be very far in the future in terms of tech or behind someone in tech, and that basically decided the war. You also got to the point where fog of war wasn't a thing anymore. So listen, I love the concept of Stellaris, and I'd be open to co-oping with people again. But as a game, as a grand strategy game, especially looking at it from the PvP perspective, like it just doesn't have what I'm looking for. Um, Imperator for me is a better PvP game than a single player game. The AI is really bad. It's very easy to cheese. And it actually
It's
took
definitely the easiest Paradox game in my opinion. So I would agree with that there.
yeah, and it actually took us a while to break this game. Like how long did we play Imperator as a group?
Probably 2 years
Yeah.
until we kind of realized we got to the point where either we need an overhaul mod or like this is done. There's going to be no real diversity here. Like you either are good at it or you're not.
Yeah, and I think a core downside, which isn't, I don't know, for the grand strategy community, maybe this isn't a downside, is that we tried bringing in a lot of new people, and every single time it's sort of like the basically the apparent complexity rather than the actual complexity scared people. Like the game looks so complicated. But in reality, once you break the game, once you figure out the meta, the game actually isn't complicated. You don't have to
There's like
care.
three things you have to do, and otherwise you're fine.
Yeah, you don't have to care about like 75% of the game basically. Like at like maybe more than that. Like you don't care about it. So like the game feels like it has a super and it does have a high learning curve. So this really killed our ability to recruit new people uh to the game. And then the disappointing part was that like it felt very complex, but then we still ended up in a position where it was like play this specific way or you suck at the game. So overall, I had a great 2 years in Imperator. I'm disappointed with the way it ended.
Right. So I've got a bit more of a sympathetic. I still like Paradox games. I think they're great. Haven't played one in a little while, maybe CK3, but that's more of a role playing game, I would say. Essentially, my take on it is that these games are probably the most, maybe Civilization games more so, but they're very transparent on having like 10, 15, hundreds of different systems all working with each other, and it's very transparent figuring out if I tweak this dial over here, how does that work for something over here, and you can build your entire nation to work on one set of dials, maybe to the detriment of some others. Um, the problems that this leads to, though, in a multiplayer context, we've already brought it up a few times, is that only certain dials, only certain things actually end up mattering. So you can just ignore a lot of them.
Yeah.
Um, and then a really important thing I think here for Paradox games is I still love all of that within the context of how multiplayer games work. Like I would be content many cases to just sit there and say, okay, we're going to have a war every 3 hours, and you're just building your nation to see how does it perform in that war. I just love that nation building internal workings part of your country.
I agree.
I realize that's not for everybody. Um, but the problem I see is that you have this war score casus belli sort of
Yes,
system,
I hate that system,
um,
to be honest.
and
I hate it.
I understand why they do it. But the problem with it is I can absolutely steamroll your country. I can destroy you. And there is really no reason why you should ever accept a peace deal for 50% or more, or anything more than 50%. That sounds like it's 50% of your country. That's not. If you're in the late game, it's tough to take more than 5% of a country's land or population or development, whatever the important metric is, off of them. And so essentially, it ends up where the beginning of the game is you see how will you build your nation. You get to the end, maybe you're the strongest and clearly the strongest, but it still takes you potentially dozens of hours to actually assert that to a point of conclusion. And then why would everybody else play if they know that you've beaten them? So it
And
gets this crystallization type of thing, is what I called it.
yeah, and so a point that I wanted to add on to that too is that like in terms of PvP, like rebalancing, like you're really looking for a situation where you can shake up the power in the game. So if you're in a situation where, let's say there's three players and one player is almost as strong as the two players combined, you really want a situation where those two players can then say, okay, let's band together, let's take on the third, let's rewrite the power system, and then you can get interesting situations where post war, after you've downsized the big one, you get to a situation where now there's a power struggle between two factions, and there's sort of a natural continuation that you want post knocking number one down to number three, let's say. And
Right.
the thing with paradox titles is that like that's actually just physically impossible. So we had a situation with Josh where we had one of the most exciting wars where Josh was number one, I was number. It seemed like I was number two.
Tied with two, maybe three. It was tough to tell at that
Yeah,
point.
yeah, it was tough. It was tough to tell where we sort of ranked, but me and the other person basically, we thought that it would be a close fight and maybe we could edge it out. If we lost, the game was over. If we won, then there would be a new power dynamic. And it was a really epic fight, very fun fight. We all walked away really excited about it.
Probably the best time I've had playing Imperator, like of those 2 years.
Yeah, exactly. Like it was great. The problem is that we broke Josh's armies, right? But then when we took the land that we were able to take, we were still in the same situation. We broke the big bad. The empire was vanquished. And after peace talks, we arrived at a situation where Josh was still number 1. Number 2 and number 3 were basically like kind of, maybe it's
I
this or
think you
maybe
were
it's
number
that.
two at that point, but we only found that out later. But
Yeah,
sure.
sure, right? But basically we got back to the same situation where we defeated the big bad, but the thing is that the big bad was still the big bad, even though like the victory felt relatively conclusive, and it also felt like relatively sort of, I don't know, like you don't want to just keep attacking the same person, like the person like over and over and over again, right? Like it felt your victories become very shallow, and you can't actually like rewrite the balance of the game
Hmm.
in these games.
Yeah, going off that example, I essentially fully conceded to the point where I had to accept whatever they were going to offer me. Like I had no choice. It's kind of like a post World War II Germany just saying, all right, like how do we get out of this? And they were only able to take off like 5-10% of my country. And so it didn't even hurt that much. It was just, all right, that was a fun war. Like, let's get back to what we were doing.
Yeah,
And so I
and
think that's kind of the big problem there.
yeah, and it's a game imposed mechanic that you can't get around.
Yeah, there's no counterplay. You have to cheese other game mechanics in order to work around it, and then it just becomes this cascade of like, what are we even doing here anymore? Why are
Yeah.
we playing this game? Um,
A thing that I wanted to add on that just came to mind is that the problem with Paradox games again for me is that you can really achieve you can achieve it in other games, but I feel like it's really bad in Paradox, maybe with Civ as well, is that you can really achieve gaps in technology, in military quality, where you are untouchable. Like there's no counterplay to the gaps that
yeah,
you can
that's what we
achieve.
kind of reached at the end, right? Where we just found out that like if you just stack buffs for just really any unit, you get to the point where if other people aren't matching that, they just lose.
Precisely, and also like in my opinion, like the real core selling point of Paradox titles is nation building. And I'm gonna say something controversial, but I think I think in the PvP context, like that very in depth and complex mechanic as it's presented, is in my opinion very shallow. And okay, and like the thing is that I think no matter how you build um your nation to a certain degree. Maybe it's not like 100% of the time, or maybe not. It's not 100% of the mechanics that go into this. Is that basically when it comes down to optimizing economies, like you're basically optimizing a spreadsheet, right? And unfortunately, when you're optimizing your country and nation building, there's just going to be a best way to do it in a video game, right? So like the actual depth to PvP, in my opinion, has to come from somewhere else. Like there's certain nation building things, like where do I build military buildings? You know, where's my primary recruitment going to come from? How do I spend my money? Where do I spend my money? That's always going to have depth. But like, how do I optimally build my economy? Like that's almost always going to have one, maybe two answers. And unfortunately, if you're going to build the depth of your game around those features, it's just not going to be a good PvP title.
So yeah, I think I agree with you on that. At least partially. I do think it's interesting that you mentioned that though, because kind of one of the things that came up with you a lot is exerting your trade influence over another person to kind of have some sort of soft power, saying don't go to war with me because your economy will tank because I import all of your stuff.
Yeah,
Who
so
else will import your
yeah,
stuff?
so that's why I'm
And so
saying
I
that
think
it's not
we,
all of it. It's not all of it, right? But
Mhm.
there's a certain like internal sort of thing where it's like there's a certain percentage of it that's just sort of like smoke and mirrors. It's actually not as deep as it looks.
Yeah, so I would agree with that. I guess what I mean is that there needs to be an aspect of peaceful interaction with other players that's still competitive. So, like,
I agree.
maybe I think a good example is, and we're going to segue into Civilization, so let's just go right into it now, is the World Congress in Civilization, a way for players to, without any exertion of maybe a technology lead or a military lead, you can still kind of impose things upon people and have some interesting scenarios in diplomacy. And so I think this is where Civilization shines in contrast to the Paradox titles. It's admittedly a lot more of a casual feel. There's a lot more abstraction going on. And like the idea that you take a civilization that builds continuously from like time immemorial to the present, it's tough to kind of find a real world example with that same level of continuity you see in the games.
Absolutely.
Um, but it allows for a lot more of the player interaction. The idea of downsizing someone, easy enough to do. The idea of working trade deals with people or maybe religious deals with people, things like that. It what it subtracts in interaction with the game, because admittedly civilization games there's really only one or two ways to play them, and that's across like all metrics. It says, okay, it's really simple, but now we'll leave it to the players to determine the difficulty, the depth, what goes on. So it's a bit more, I would say it's a bit more emergent, not so much in how you play the game, but how you play against other players.
I agree.
John, what are your
I,
thoughts there?
I no, I like listen. I absolutely agree. Like I think that I liked Civilization a bit as a single player game. I played it mostly co-op, but then switching over into PvP, I had the most fun because you especially if you can like assemble a big group like 8 to 10 people, like that's where Civilization really starts to shine because one, you can play a Civilization game start to finish on the right settings, of course, in a day. right? So if you get a
Right.
dedicated group, then you're going to be doing, really complex diplomacy, lots of like really awesome interactions with people, basically all day. And that's something that you can't actually do in other games, of course. Um, and I agree. Like the complexity comes from sort of human interactions and how you balance things and stuff like that. Like unfortunately, like the actual nation building mechanics, war fighting, things like this, like that's in my opinion very stale and not very interesting in Civilization 5. But diplomacy with other players is really where it shines because Civilization is a game where it's easy to actually pack 8 people into a room, 10 people into not like a chat lobby or something, and like have these people sit there all day and get through like building an empire from the Stone Age to the modern age, right?
Yeah, and I think an important part of that is like theoretically you could do a lot of the same things if you just played with like some sort of mod for the Paradox games where you just like switch up how wars work. Like with a couple of tweaks, you could see how a Paradox game would get to that, at least in the diplomacy context. But I think the simplicity of Civilization, where I can just very quickly look at your country and know like, okay, you're going to be better than me in research, worse in culture, better than me military, but you're poor. Like I think it makes the diplomacy easier to get to points where you can make decisions about it. There were times where I would spend literally hours staring at the map in Imperator, trying to think of like, is the other person better than me or not? Like, could I declare war on them? Are they wealthier? Like, how good are they? And turns out you can see all that in tooltips, which is kind of a bug, I think. But I think the simplicity of just I can at a glance get an idea of what you're doing, how you're performing, and then make deals off of that might sound like, oh, that's pretty basic, that's simple, but I think it actually makes it more interesting in the long run.
But bonus points too for Civilization. So a mechanic that is at least in Stellaris and in Period are completely missing. Is this mechanic where you have to overcome fog of war with scouting? And Civilization does have this feature. So this is something that I'm like a huge stickler about is that like you should keep eyes and it should be something you work for to keep eyes on your opponent, right? Like it should there is a spy mechanic in Imperator, but it's sort of like very transparent and against a person, like they end up just like killing your spy or something like that like immediately. Civilization 5 does have that mechanic and I really do appreciate that.
Yeah, the whole idea of that. And I think what it really comes down to is the immediacy of things, right? In Civilization, if you lose a city in a war, like you technically can get it back in the peace deal and things like that. Like you haven't fully lost it at that point. They have to like give it up. But for all intents and purposes, you've lost that city. You can have your entire nation be occupied in a Paradox title and then just get out of the war scot free. So there's a little bit more. It lends towards more dynamic gameplay and high risk, high reward.
You,
I think is where it gets to.
you also have like in Imperator, like the wars aren't that destructive, and if your territory is occupied, you still get like a certain percentage of production
Yeah,
out
the
of that
fact that you
territory.
get 80% of production in occupied territory is incredible to me. But
Like you can't even like for example like a really interesting tactic to explore in Civilization, Total War, etc. is to attack like economic centers of mass. Like this whole concept of center, like the principle of center of mass. Like I tried really hard to apply um, center of mass problem solving in Puritor, but it just sort of felt like you
it didn't
basically
matter.
like one, it didn't matter, and two, when it did matter it was basically psychological. Like there were situations where like I would literally like sail over 200,000 troops and land my troops out of the blue on top of someone's capital, right? And psychologically this mattered to them, but like in the end it basically didn't, and like that's a problem, right? Like the fact that I can't actually look at your country and be like, this is how I would attack it and why, and have my reasons be economically motivated in some capacity, like to economically harm you. Like that's a core problem. I also felt that like there were certain situations like islands were geographically important, but apart from that, some like mountain passageways and once you get into terrain modifiers and stuff like that. But I also think that things like geography didn't matter as much as it should in a strategy game
Yeah,
in
I would
Imperator.
agree with that. Like the geography didn't matter. It was more of just the starting conditions because those games start with a filled out map and it's just like some areas are better than others and they're kind of always going to be that way. But it's not
Yes.
because of the geography, it's because of other factors that are
Yeah.
like hard coded into the game.
Not to beat on Paradox, like I love Paradox. I love those games. I think we just unfortunately we're sort of coming at a point where like we beat Imperator to death. Um,
Yeah. I think it's also a case of we like if you love something, you want to make it better. People always say this when they're like protesting in their country. So I think it's a case of we see this franchise that has like the bare bones of what could be incredible, but there's like a couple of holes in it that if you fix those, I think it has incredible potential. But
yes.
unfortunately, they hold it back.
And I think like that's actually a really good segue into Total War because I feel like so when you talk about Paradox titles and you talk about Civilization, what is it clear is that there's a clear trend of innovation from the companies, right? And there's a clear trend of working towards better titles, better mechanics, better graphics, blah blah blah. Whether or not you agree with some of the innovations and the directions that things have gone, like that's extremely clear for those franchises. And if you move on to Total War, it's more difficult to actually have this conversation because like unfortunately there's going to be so many caveats, right? And I know that you've only sort of got into Warhammer, but I just want to get this sort of like off my chest as like a beginning thing because
Go for it.
when you play Warhammer, you are missing so many mechanics that used to be amazing in these games. Like one was, for example, Shogun 2, Medieval Rome. You had organic populations, like actual numbers in your faction. When you recruited units from that place, that number went down. It was obvious and very clear that sometimes you would over recruit in an area and it would economically damage you. You could drain all of the able bodies from that area into the military. Um like that was just something that happens. And now you have this like abstracted sort of um like growth mechanic now, right? And like the growth just means you can build bigger
And it
buildings.
never goes down, or like very rarely does.
Yeah, you also had things like you had organic, like economic growth, like actual economic growth. You had tax levels, so you could put your tax levels down, and you'd get more organic growth, population growth, economic growth in your town or village or whatever. Um, um, and now that just doesn't really exist. It used to be that trade routes, the longer you kept them open and free, the better that they got. As far as we can tell, it's like they're static now. You used to be able to easily raid trade routes. Now they're just abstractions. Like I can't even see the trade routes on the map in Warhammer. They used to be physical trade routes that enemy ships or armies could go steal money from.
So kind of like the caravans or trade ships in Civilization.
Yeah, like you could go blockade the ports for where yeah, precisely. You could go blockade like they were a little bit more abstracted where like you wouldn't actually have to like like they were physical on the map, but you didn't have to direct them. They were sort of automatically generated, like as if your population. It's like you sign like you're at the level of abstraction where you sign a free trade agreement with another faction, and then your civilization, like your people, sort of like take care of the details because like it's not up to you to like connect the dots. You know what I mean? Like it's like
Right.
we're allowed to trade now. Our people will take care of it. Um, it used to be that you could recruit armies without a lord. Like it used to be, and you used to be able to fight battles with those armies, and like the like, fun mechanics where it would be like if you won a battle without like what is now called a lord in Warhammer, you would get a chance to promote that person to a noble, and they'd become a character, like whatever was the quote
Hmm.
unquote captain. There's also things where like the games in Warhammer are very character focused, but like in a very shallow way. Like in old Total War titles, based off of what happened to your person, they would pick up like retainers, aids, attributes, and so on. That were organic to the game and what was happening to your character. So you cared about your characters. There's no like there used to be a food mechanic. You actually have to produce enough food to feed your people. You know what I mean? So in
Right.
Rome, you used to be able to target economic centers of mass by seeing like one time
They're shipping grain from Alexandria to
like
Constantinople, so like
exactly
it's kind of obvious.
yeah, you could make decisions where it's like I'm going to attack this specific spot because if I go in there and I attack it, I'm going to probably starve that civilization, right? So,
Right.
like these things are all absent, and as far as I am aware, so it's sort of strange where like Total War is in this weird place where they used to have all these like great mechanics, and they've streamlined and abstracted a lot of them, and as far as I'm aware, this is primarily because they don't want to bug fix. So I just watched a really good YouTube video where it was basically explaining that they don't actually have an engine at Total War. What they do
What?
is every time they develop a new game, they have like multiple lines of cloning where like they'll clone the last game and then modify it into the new game, and then they'll try to innovate. And whenever they run into bugs that they don't know how to fix, they'll just delete that mechanic.
Huh. So that that sounds like great developing principles.
and s- and
Um,
basically what that's arrived in is like somehow Warhammer 3 is simultaneously it has more units, the characters are sort of like in terms of like abilities and stuff like that, like I guess that's kind of cool. The maps are bigger, there's more factions, but at the same time the game is simpler than the game that was out 20 years ago.
right. Um, I guess what I would say to that is like, to be fair, it's hard to imagine how like some like seductive demons, how their society works. Like maybe you could come up with that and that's cool. But I feel like
That
this is not why people play a Warhammer game.
so I definitely agree with that, and I understand that, but the historical titles have also taken that sort of like the same direction,
Same
basically.
trajectory.
So
Okay.
like for example, in Rome 2, there used to be like very like in the previous titles there were complex like family tree things where you had to worry about like it's almost like Imperator or like CK type titles where you have to worry about your family tree, you have to marry
Like your
your
dynastic
sons.
politics and all of
Yeah, you
that.
have dynastic politics. You actually have like internal government workings where like if you're in a republic, you really have to make sure that the other party that carries the weight of balance in the in the Senate or whatever, like they need to be happy. You know what I mean?
All
Like
right, so that's a garbage feature. I hate how that worked in Imperator, so we can keep that one out of it. Um, but
I
just
guess,
so
yeah.
in the interest of time, because this could probably be its own episode, just talking
Absolutely.
about like Total War then versus now. Um, where would you kind of, or I guess, how would you evaluate it based on some of the things that we've talked about?
Total War?
Yeah, the Total War series, just single player, multiplayer, and how it kind of comes together in a grand campaign context.
From a so let's I guess from a PvP perspective, I think basically what you have, assuming the game is like Warhammer 3 or Rome 2, like a full release of a game, you basically have a space where if the devs do it right in Total War, you get a space where there is no quote unquote meta. There's optimal ways to play that clash against each other, and players can have a really good time sort of going back and forth and pushing each other to like a limit that sort of like doesn't really exist because eventually you get to a point where you're really just swapping out optimal ideas to counter what you know the other person's doing. And
Right. My take on it from the what I've seen of the Total War series is it has a unique space in the grand strategy like portfolio, I guess if you could call it that, where Civilization and Paradox games, they do have some element of mechanical skill. Like reinforcing battles in Paradox games is important. Um, you have simultaneous turns during wars in Civilization, so like whoever clicks first with a ranged unit gets the attack off first and these type of things. But Total War, you fight all the battles. So like you could theoretically build a nation that's just on paper better than the other person's and lose to them because you're terrible at the battles. You can have these
that's true.
upsets and things
That's
like
true.
that.
That's true. And there's also like a certain level of like actual campaigning, for example, like something that you'll learn unfortunately, is that like if you're not careful and methodical, you're not scouting, and you're playing against someone who's a little devious, like you can run into situations where, like, let's say you casually Like you end up with a front where you should have complete like a majority in some sense. Like you can run into ambushes, you can run into situations where like a player will like valiantly defend a city, and stuff like that. So you're presented with these real choices in real situations where you can make sincere choices on the campaign map that are just detrimental, um, to your efforts, right? Like losing a whole army against a player, is really bad in Total War, right? Like because it takes time to recruit that army.
Right. I think that also the fact that a lot of the like when people play these grand strategy games, at some point you're playing it for the military conflict,
Yes,
um, and because we've uh, the level of abstraction there is not as deep, it allows for more interesting diplomacy because in something like Imperator, you can just surprise me on a different front. I'll get there eventually. I'll maybe turn you back and get my cities back. It's okay. It's fine. But in Total War, if you surprise me on a front, you could just potentially succeed there fast enough that I don't have any ability to oppose you. And so it changes how your treaties work and where you actually have to staff your borders. You need to make sure that you have some sort of understanding of where things stand uh, on pretty much all fronts. And then the treaties you make, instead of just saying like, okay, don't attack me, I won't attack you, you can maybe get down to something as granular as like, I need to see X number of armies, and those can be the only armies that I see on this front. Like
I agree.
you can get that specific with it, um, which
Yeah, yeah,
maybe is unintuitive given that it seems simpler, but the simplicity I think means that you've got more options.
yeah. How slow your armies transverse your empire, and how valuable individual armies actually are, just amplifies the complexity from a PvP standpoint. I agree, 100%.
Yeah, it feels like you brought this up a lot of like the Greek successor states just kind of putting out fires across the empire, and to some degree, you're kind of playing in that sort of context as opposed to Civilization or Paradox games, where it feels more of like a modern like 20th century warfare with like slow moving discrete fronts. Land doesn't actually change hands until a peace treaty. This is like I come in, I sack your city and take it, like it's just mine now. We don't need a peace treaty to enforce that.
I I
And
I also think that Civilization and Paradox games basically, like if you have parity or close to parity between countries, I think that you're basically going to arrive at some meta that is essentially grinding, like a World War I, slam into each other, let's outproduce each other, um, let's grind this out, right? And in Total War, that can happen. Um, but it's really up to the players and the type of meta that they're experimenting with, like the type of headspace that they're in. Like there are chances to finesse, as I want to say, in the wars. Like it's not a resource. It's not like who can produce more. It like there is situations where battlefield brilliancy, as you said, can sort of edge you out, so you get into a space where you're not stuck in a grind against the other person.
mhm, and I think what it means is that the game is most dynamic. You can go from first to last in the span of like a single session, in
Yes.
the span of an hour if things go terribly wrong. But you can also do the opposite. So while in Imperator, if you just fall behind, you're behind, it's done, like it's over. You can have a roller coaster ride of a game, which is if we kind of talked about what do we like in strategy games, that was kind of one of the key things. Always having peers, or ideally, always having someone stronger than you that you can eventually go and beat.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
what this does mean, though, and I think we both had this in our last point, is that uh, in Imperator, you're kind of, or Civilization, you're doing everything at once, right? You're building your nation and you're fighting the wars if they happen, but you kind of get into some real life applications in Total War where because essentially it takes you away from the nation building to fight the battles, things can progress quickly in game terms, but very slowly in terms of real life time, where potentially you can only pass one or two turns in an entire like 3 hour session if it's just tons of battles from tons of wars going on.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Precisely. And I think that as long as your group is okay with that, then I think that like it's still very valuable. Like I find it very entertaining to watch people fight battles. Even
Mhm.
even if it's against the at least early fighting against the AI, it's annoying watching a player like mid game when they should be steamrolling AI fight the AI. But
Right.
um,
Right.
yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. Like I think that Total War leaves a lot to be desired from a lot of like nation building and like sort of character sort of perspectives. It leaves a lot on the table that one it used to have and two like we know it could have. But from a complete sort of I want to fight other human beings, I think that as of today I am the most excited about Total War.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree. I think there's some other titles we could talk about that we both don't have a ton of experience with and that are kind of newer. But I think we've kind of put a bow on it there with just those three. So, John, any, I guess, final remarks you wanted to just bring up? We've got a lot to talk about for some future episodes, but anything you wanted to add here to any of the listeners?
Nothing really. Like, if you made it this far, I appreciate that you listened to us. You know, Josh and I are really excited to talk about these things. You know, we spend a lot of our week thinking very hard about these games, so we hope someone else finds value in all of this brain power that we're putting into it. So I definitely appreciate it. I think we're gonna have a lot of fun topics sort of coming up. Definitely more like we'll take deeper dives into specific topics. Like this was a big overview. So, anyways, yeah,
Hmm.
I appreciate any listener that's made it this far.
Yeah, absolutely. Same from my end. Thank you guys for listening. This has been Actions and Reactions, and we'll see you next time.